don't know today what we're going to discover tomorrow, which was Karl Popper. The simple fact is that there are things out there.
See if you can keep your train of thought.
That there are dangers out there which we will not know until we run into them. The biggest problems that I see that we face is not so much the technology and the attention of the individuals, but that the corporate systems that we now have in place are masking human values to a degree that things will be developed in isolation that will not necessarily be to the benefit of us in general. I see our problem is more one of governance than it is of technology. The technology itself, of course, is neutral. The problem that we have now is that our technology is getting so good that it is surpassing our ability to react to it. And so individuals and organizations, particularly systems which are designed in some ways to dehumanize individuals, will be using that to their own benefit, which is not necessarily to the benefit of individuals or humans.
I've been ordered to say something intelligent. Okay. I agree that we have to be concerned, perhaps leery, and very proactive about how we deal with who's in charge. And in a world where we have an internet and such transparency and hidden agendas at the same time, it's kind of like we're caught in this dichotomy. On one hand, we have this enormously rapid communication and ability to decipher information quickly, get the facts anywhere we can, quickly, Google. But let's take a look at Wikipedia. Wikipedia is so full of misinformation, it's astounding to me. And even in the little area where I have even an ounce of expertise, I look at the Wikipedia articles and I read students' papers who send them to me, asking me to go over some things. I'm going, where did you get this information? This is incorrect. I know, because I was there. And that's very disconcerting to me in my little world, at my age. I think about, what about the people who are really famous, who've really done something meaningful in the world? What do they do when they go to Wikipedia and see misinformation about the area that their expertise is? So that's very frightening to me, that even in the world's largest encyclopedia, Wikipedia, that we all have access to, we don't pay for it. We all get it, and anyone can edit it. Who's really editing it? And if you go on anything related to transhumanism, you will find the name Lore Master. And I have no idea who Lore Master is. I have an inclination who it might be, but that person puts in all the information, or most of the information. And if you go in and try to change Wikipedia data and correct some things, that person, Lore Master, will go in and change it back to what he or she wants. And that to me is frightening. So this is a little Wikipedia in a little world, in my little world, in an area where I have some information. Think about it on a larger scale. How do we deal with that? So I do have a lot of concern, but at the same time, I believe in the proactivity of the human and groups of people to get together and to stand up for our rights, and that's why I support morphological freedom.
Right, it's working. Amazing. Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's a really big subject, the interaction between rights and risks in relation to new technology. I think the first thing I'd like to talk about is the rights to access to new technology, which is perhaps the simplest aspect because it is something that can be discussed even when there is no perception of risk of the new technology actually being bad for people individually. It's that simply there would be a risk of unequal access and therefore unequal quality of life. I think, I mean, and this comes up a lot in respect of the technology that might postpone aging, so it's something that I get asked about a great deal. I think, you know, the tendency is to believe that, well, a lot of people I find anyway, tend to believe that if inequality of access to technology became too severe, then it becomes so big a problem that the technology shouldn't have been invented in the first place. And I find that to be very short-sighted. It seems to me that however strongly one believes that inequality of quality of life is a problem, nevertheless, it can only ever be a temporary problem, and therefore one that could be more easily alleviated than the ostensibly permanent problem that would arise if one didn't develop the technology in the first place. I think this is really an example of the sort of thing that I'll probably talk about a good deal more tomorrow evening in my other talk, of having a sense of proportion really about the overall amount of benefit to mankind that one will eventually achieve in the long run by developing technology versus not developing it. And I think that, well, in fact I would go so far to say I've never come across a case where the risk of unequal access to a particular technology is sufficient to make any kind of case for not developing the technology in the first place.
I have to disagree with that one, I think. Look, if I remember Andrew's talk at the beginning, is Andrew still here? He was talking about, he gave the prisoner's dilemma, and he talked about, he asked for a straw poll of the audience, and he said, okay guys, how many of you want to live to 150? And probably about 80% of the audience put their hands up. He also pointed out the Earth has got finite resources, which we all agree with, and he also pointed out that the people in this room are the top 1%. The simple fact of the matter is, if we were to spread the resources out across the whole planet, none of you would live to 150. Because the curve is so left skewed that the resource, if you were to spread it out, I'm not suggesting we would do that, but if we did, then it would mean it would be not possible. Therefore, the prisoner's dilemma basically says to you guys in this room, if you want to live to 150, support the status quo. Support the fact that we have a massive division of wealth and maintain that, because that system is the thing that gives you the possibility of living now to 150 years.
Judge, can I just say something? That principle of the 1%, which we are the 1%.
We are the 1%, that's correct.
But of course, that principle fractalizes within, let's say, the OECD. There's a 1% within the OECD who would face exactly the same prisoner's dilemma and may decide to cut us loose too, if the cost of speciation becomes exorbitant. Because that's in fact what your argument is.
Yeah, well, I'm essentially saying you've got to realise that we...
Speaking to my friend.
The simple fact is that we are incredibly wealthy in this country. But we are wealthy at the expense of others. We have become wealthy at the expense of others. Now, there's no doubt that as a result of that difference in wealth, there has been massive explosion of knowledge, which ultimately helps everyone. It helps the people in the future. People in the future who are poor now, their children and later generations become better off because of the information that we gain. But it doesn't help the ones that exist right now. So my point is that we are, as we speak, causing, or our world model, our lifestyle is actually bad for other parts of the world. But if you want to have a chance at this extropian vision, then you have to maintain it.
Not necessarily. I mean, we could parrot Bill Joy for here to eternity, and it would still get us back to the same thing. It's just not going to work to go back to the, the farmland with a horse and a sickle and get out there and do our work. It's just not going to happen. What we have to do is to think carefully and logically about the issue of distribution. And we talked about that earlier. We combined the Buckminster Fuller scenario with dealing with we've got enough. So what is the problem? The problem is not that we don't have enough, the problem is distribution. And another problem is, do we need everything that we have? Certainly not. How many people are obese? How many people are overweight? Maybe stop eating so much, for goodness sake, or maybe share the food that you've got with other people who don't have food. I certainly took 2 bags of clothes recently to help people where I live so that they could have clothes. I work once a month doing Meals on Wheels where I take food to people who could not get food for themselves. I work for a home for incurables with people so malformed that they were not allowed outside. I volunteered at the St. Jude's Hospital for Children who knew they were going to die from cancerous diseases. So it's not that we don't have the people that care. We do have the people who care. I'm not unique or solo in this regard. We're here because we do care. Aubrey is not involved with regenerative medicine because he wants to be the 1% of the 1% of the 1% that survives. It's because he knows it's the way to go. He knows it's the most respectful thing that we can do for our species. And I think that's one of the salvos of especially the extropian view and the transhumanist view. And that's why certain technologies like molecular manufacturing could solve some of these problems.
Yeah, I think one of the major flaws in what you said actually is the impact of progress. So, I mean, if we ask the question, how long does it take for, let's say, 50% of the population to reach a level of prosperity or a level of quality of life that only 1% had at time 0, whatever they had at some given time, then, you know, it's a while, but that time is shrinking all the time as technology accelerates, and it's already a lot smaller than 150 years. So, if we talk about how this impacts the merits of developing technology to postpone aging, which is the topic we were discussing, then I think the whole logic really breaks down. One can't make an argument on the basis of the merits of equality of access, simply because even if one did take that into account, we still don't need to actually deny other people these technologies in order to benefit from them ourselves, given those sorts of time frames.
Well, I think first of all, division world is increasing, it's not decreasing, but you're correct in the time to uptake is decreasing. However, I think, let's look at another core problem. You've been at this for 20, 30 years, or longer.
15.
15 years. And this is probably the most important subject ever. How well funded are they?
Better than I used to be, but I don't understand the relevance of the question.
The point is, how is it that, what is it about our society that means something as important as the work that Aubrey is doing, that Natasha is doing, is not the most well-funded project on the planet? Why is that? Why is it that most people in this room will put their hand up and say, I want to live for 150 years, but this is not the most funded project in the world?
Hyperbolic discounting.
Pardon?
Hyperbolic discounting and present bias. It's not something which helps me now. It's not helping a disease which I have now. It's helping me in 30 years' time or in 50 years' time. People are terrible at investing in things which have long-term payoffs.
Yeah, that's true. The economics of it are not visible right away, and oftentimes when we think about economics, we equate economics with immediate reward rather than a long-term strategy. That's really true. It seems to me that most people are concerned with just surviving on a daily basis. And that's why larger projects don't get the funding that they need, or there has to be an X Prize, or there has to be some kind of riveting, event that takes place that wakes people up. So it's a hard issue. It's a very, very difficult issue. And you bring up an important question, but it's an impractical question because it's recursive. It kind of answers itself.
All right, I think what I'm saying is that the problem is in us. Now, the question that was asked before about sex was interesting, It was saying, okay, is sex necessary, etc. Well, that's, I think, a very good question. I mean, if you look evolutionarily, why did you develop sex in the first place? Obviously, there's a large amount of suggestion that sexual selection was part of it, and the fact that you have two sexes competing was one of the reasons why the humans developed the big brain in the first place, so that men could chat on women better. But, no, seriously. But the problem is in us. If you look at Second Life, is everyone running around in white robes having a Socratic dialogue? No. The guys are all muscled up, the girls are all dressed like tarts. It's just it's a hypersexual environment in most cases. Would that be correct?
Or violent.
Or violent.
I wouldn't know.
That's what we are inside, and that is where the biggest problems that all of us face. Our short-term emphasis, which is obviously correct. Why aren't we funding Aubrey? Because of our basic human nature. Is not the sort of thing that says, no, I don't want to fund that uncool thing. I want my Ferrari right now. Therein lies the problems. It's already in us. Now, the question is, should we, when we move to the future, if we want to retain our humanity, do we have to retain those parts of us that we now say are, well, maybe they're not necessarily a good thing. But if we don't retain them, are we still human? If we cut out our sexual side, that's a large part of our brain. So, it's a hard philosophical question.
Yes.
The question is, do you think it's appropriate to allow a lot of different psychological attitudes? I'm talking here about emotions and the programming of emotions, for example, openness, particularly applies to sexual. So the question is, should you look at emotions as part of your transhumanity, the types of emotions? Should you be looking at the psychological emotions as part of your humanity and transhumanity, the types of them?
Yes, I think it's psychological emotions. I mean, I often talk about refined emotions, where you develop the emotions to a level that is appropriate rather than being crazy all the time and running off, doing things that are bad for ourselves. We become more mature, we maturate as we develop. We learn not to stick our hands in the fire. We learn not to be cruel to people. We learn to be, we acquiesce, we get along with people more as we mature and develop a certain social grounding for our behaviors. But that doesn't mean that we ought not to have sex, or that sex won't play a part in the future, or that we won't be kind and we won't be stingy.
Coming back to the topic that we've been asked to discuss in a more general sense, I think one thing it's worth bearing in mind is that this tension between rights and risks is not something new. It's been around throughout the history of the development of technology, and perhaps it extends even beyond technology. If we think of the Industrial Revolution, we could think of the rights that the Luddites thought that they were defending when they were resisting the development and the propagation of new technology. We can think of it, if we look again at, for example, the introduction of hygiene and vaccines and antibiotics that reduced infant mortality and thereby increased the necessity to have fewer children. Well, one could say that people have the right to have as many children as they wanted to, but that wasn't a reason to actually hesitate to disseminate that technology and that knowledge so as to save lives. So these things are not all that new, and I think in many cases the best way to actually answer the question whether we should go in a particular direction in terms of new technology, whether it's in developing it or disseminating it, is to look at past examples that show close parallels in terms of what we did and whether we think what we did was correct.
Going back to one of the, to the topic, one of the comments made regarding the governance. I'm going to ask the question to coming a bit back down to earth. I just happen to be an engineer involved in safety engineering, and I'm thinking even, you know, somewhat old technology like transportation, railway, airspace, which are somewhat established now. They're posing serious risks, and the development and the deployment of them pose today very serious risks. And relating that to the fact that they're very complex, become more complex, and they can only be harnessed through very large organization by, you know, divide and conquer, specialization, all that. I'm fearful thinking about this very futuristic technology that are mind-boggling in terms of complexity and their possible unwanted side effects. How we're going to handle that governance problem? I think it's key, because yeah, you can, you know, run off and do all these fancy things, but who's to say they're not going to get out of control? Actually, it's very likely they're going to get out of control with very serious risk in terms of safety and health of a large number of people, which may end up being worse than the benefit that they bring.
Well, you were asking this question. The movie 12 Monkeys came to mind, and to me that's just, you know, one of those horror scenarios where things are going great and one person takes a virus that's going to kill off the whole species, all life forms on Earth, and the film starts and goes back, and that moment, then you've been through the story and then you see it happening. Are we at that point now? Or, you know, we have to ask ourselves, what are the risks of what we're doing? And at the same time, we have to do what we do. We're human beings, for God's sake. And endemic to our species is the ability to problem solve. And we will never be satisfied being complacent. We've got to do it, or else we'll just, you know, we'll go neurotic. And that would be far worse than taking a risk. At the same time, it's so important for us who are proactive and pro-technology or pro-life extension to be aware of all the possibilities of risk and to be highly scholarly about it, to know it, not to brush it off, not to pretend it doesn't exist, and not to frown on it or discredit it, but to be aware of it and to respect it, and to be able to understand the skills of futurology, you know, as I talked earlier, scenario development, systems analysis, strategic planning, long-range planning, backcasting, all these different methods, to be able to do that. I mean, that should be as commonplace for any of us who are interested in the future in our various diverse fields as anything else we do. And so perhaps the deficit is that we all don't know these skills well enough. We're just learning how to maintain our bodies. We're learning that when we go to the doctor, we don't sit there like idiots being told what's wrong with us. We go with a paper and a pencil and we say, okay, now what's going on with me? Or this is what I see going on, what do you think? And the doctor no longer stands above us, dictating to us what's wrong with us in a certain language that we don't understand what the hell he or she is saying, but we understand the terminology. We have to get to that level where we all become smarter than we have been in the past to understand how to deal with risk and how to ask questions about risk.
Yes, I've got to say I agree very much with what Natasha just said, and especially about the quantification of risk. So, you know, I think a lot of this comes down to, you know, what are the risks? But that's only step one. One's then got to absolutely have a much better feel than most people do for how to quantify those risks. You know, because really, one could say, well, again, coming back to the title of this panel, there is, you know, in a very real sense, in a very general sense, a human right to be protected from risk. But then, if there are competing risks, and it's a question of finding the right balance between the two, then one has to actually have some way of quantifying what those risks are. An obvious example that comes to mind is the risk of medical harm from taking a drug or some experimental therapy that is in fact bad for you or can be bad for you. One has to have a good and unbiased way of evaluating the probability that a drug will do a certain amount of harm against the probability that the drug will do other people a certain amount of good, and coming to a conclusion, both individually and as a society, about where that balance ought to come. This is something that a lot of people would say has not been achieved throughout the developed world in respect of the regulation of new medicines. There was a report several years ago which concluded that the number of lives lost as a result of the slow approval of good drugs in the USA was at least 50 times as many as the number of lives lost through the inappropriate approval of drugs that were harmful. So, you know, we can ask whether that's a good thing or not, but most people don't even ask the question.
All right, but look at part of the problem is the information that we get. We're too lazy most of the time to filter it. I mean, how many here have heard of the melanin scandal in China, right?
Yeah.
10, 15 Chinese babies died. How many here have heard about the Vioxx scandal in the US, which happened a couple of years before? Vioxx. How many? And the death rate from that was 50,000. 50,000 US citizens died as a result of a drug which probably should not have been released. But you don't even hear about it, or very few people hear about it, or the magnitude of the claim. We have become lazy, and therein lies the biggest danger that we have, that all of us are guilty of being lazy. Instead of spending our spare time saving up money and sending it to people who will do something with us that will help us in the future, we will watch our Foxtel, we will sit on our couches, we will get fat. We have become lazy, and I think that is probably the biggest danger and risk that we all face.
I've just got a question regarding the impact of longevity treatment becoming, I guess, freely available. So at the moment, if a 17-year-old says that they've lived a full life, they've done everything they want to...
So you said a 17-year-old?
A 17-year-old, yes.
Right.
Has lived a full life, done everything they want to, and they've decided they've had enough, so they're going to jump off a bridge. Society at the moment rushes to prevent such a course of action and says, you are medically ill, or you are mentally ill, and prevents that. But that's, I guess, based on the idea that because they're 17, there is a significant amount that they would probably experience if they didn't take that course of action. My question is, a lot of people talk about the idea, I want to live for as long as I want to, 200, 700, however long, and then when I'm done, I'll finish it. But when there is no limit, when everyone could effectively live to be 1 million, wouldn't society take the same approach and say, I'm sorry, I'm not going to let you do that, you're only 300 years old?
I certainly believe that they would, yes. I'm quite sure that at the moment, telephone hotlines that help people not to commit suicide do not ask them how old they are before they start on that. Right. So I completely agree with you. I think that the question of how long ago one was born already plays a much smaller role in the way we treat people in society than the question of how long we think they have to live. And if the question of how long we think, if those two numbers cease to be correlated the way they are today, then of course we end up with the conclusion that you've just described.
Doesn't that lead to forced immortality?
Oh, well, it depends what you mean by forced. So the question was, for those of you who didn't hear it, doesn't that lead to forced immortality? I don't really know. I mean, we try quite hard to change the minds of people who want to die soon, even though they're still mentally and physically healthy. But we don't exactly, tie them down and stop them. I mean, only when they're already in jail, anyway. The question of how hard we try there may be a grey area there. I'm not exactly sure. I certainly don't think in terms of a future in which we tie people down and rejuvenate them by force.
Remember also, look, in neural archives we face this question a lot because we're storing actual neural tissue, brain tissue. And people say, but what if I don't want to be reawakened, X thousand years in the future? And I think it's important to realise that if we've got the technology to fix all that, ice crystal damage that's taken place and the catabolization, etc., that's occurred, and the obvious damage that killed you in the first place, then we can rebuild you so you would like to wake up.
Another thing we have to add to the equation here is the definition of life and the definition of death. We have very stable, concretized definition of what is life according to life in biology and death. And that's changed though. We used to hold a candle up to someone's nose and see if it flickered. If that flickered, they were alive. If it didn't, they were dead, even if they were breathing very slowly. Same with a mirror, for moisture coming out of the nose. And I think it was in the late 1800s, people were buried with a bell or a string so they could call for help if they came out of their unconscious state. So there's always these iffy areas of death. But again, going back to life and death, there could be many, many different options on death. Some could have partial death, finite death, infinite death, partial death. I mean, we have to realize that as we're redefining norm and normalcy and species-typical parameters, we'll also be redefining when you're alive and when you're dead and when you're really, really dead. But then the Christian religion and other types of religions believe that you never die, you just change matter. So then you get into the whole area of what is matter. And if you get into molecular manufacturing and atom to atom and molecules, and it's just a recombination of matter. So I think we need to look at these issues of life and death outside the strict parameters of what is life and death, but what are alternatives as far as terminology is concerned.
Yeah, this is one of the best examples, really, of how societal preferences just blithely ignore scientific reality sometimes. The fact is that the whole idea of having a two-state state of being, either you're alive or you're dead, is greatly at variance with biological reality. The fact is the transition between being unequivocally alive and being unequivocally dead is a process, and it's a process about which we know only a certain amount, and perhaps about which we can only know a certain amount. Actually, Natasha's husband did his PhD on this very topic a long, long time ago. So yeah, I mean, it's really a great example of how we have to, I guess, come to an accommodation of the incompatibility between scientific reality and human psychology.
Can I just ask people who haven't asked a question today to put up their hands? So if you want to ask a question, you haven't asked one today.
Going with the theme that you just mentioned about notions of life and death, and I suppose touching on almost immortality, you've mentioned religion. What do you think the outcome of that will be in terms of some of the major world religions, monotheistic religions, or even religions that may be more sophisticated, like Buddhism or animism or whatever,
Do you mean what is the outcome of life extension on religious views that...
Yeah, religious views. Well,
it's interesting, and I'm not an expert on this, but it's interesting just from observations and various conversations and what I read, religion's changing. I mean, it's interesting how religion will bend with the times a little bit. Not so much, but a little bit, and it depends on the different religions, but I see there being a compatibility rather than a very clear discourse. I think that by and large people want to live and be healthy and they want their loved ones to live. And we will do anything to save the life of our loved ones, our children, our parents, our spouses, our partners. So when push comes to shove, we will bend the rules just to keep someone alive in this state, no matter if we believe in an afterlife, from my observations. Do you have any comments?
Yeah, look, I think that religion obviously exists where there's anything we don't know. Anywhere, any space that exists which is unknown is where religion can live and hide. There'll always be such a space. So even if we live 500 years, even if we live forever, I think there will always be some space for religion until we reach some kind of omniscient state. That's too hypothetical. So no, look, I agree with Natasha. I think religion will just bend with it and say, oh look, you know, how old was Methuselah? 720 something years? What's the problem?
1969.
969. We've been there before. We predicted it. What's the problem?
Yeah, I also agree. Is this working still? Suddenly turn the top off. All right, let's try. Yeah, excellent. Content. Right, yeah, I also agree. I think actually I would go even further. I think, you know, Christianity, for example, seemed to survive the advent of the theory of evolution, which is probably a much bigger change in terms of what we know about how the world works than anything that might be introduced by technology. Furthermore, of course, since aging causes suffering, postponement of aging is clearly a good thing, and it would be a sin not to work towards the postponement of aging. So one, you know, one doesn't really have, I don't think, very much problems there. After all, another aspect is that how long we want to live is not really a determinant of how long we do live, necessarily. If you believe that God is omnipotent, then it means that God can strike people down with a thunderbolt however healthy they are, and so it's not really an issue.
Hi. I'm probably a bit unusual in here in that I'm actually one of the people who's building one of these things, AGI. And there's a real possibility that just up the road here in the foreseeable future, if I go to the extent of humanoid form, that there'll be people marching up and down out in front of the building in Bouverie Street with placards. What's on the placards?
What year is this?
10 to 20. But I'm building really little things first, 5 to 10. And the chips aren't based on computing this. Surprise, surprise, and all but Wiener-esque. Anyway, what's on the placard? Notice here I'm doing due diligence, and I'm talking to people who do it, and talk about this stuff. And I'm really interested because I want to plan for this.
Okay, let me get the scenario here. There's a bunch of small people running around in South America with placards, and we want to, and the year is 2050, and we want to know what's on the placards.
Yeah, they're running around outside my building in Bouverie Street.
Okay, with placards.
With placards, getting upset about something.
Oh, what, and the year's 2050?
I think what he's asking,
About 2030, maybe.
2030.
what's going to upset people about AGI?
And we don't know if these are humans or not, but they have agency.
Right, they're getting upset about my AGI, which I just finished building.
I think what he's asking is what is going to upset people about building intelligent machines.
Is that right? Yeah, just
What happened to sex? No, I'm just kidding.
You've missed the point somehow.
I know, I think
That's what you think he means.
Yeah, we can start from your assumption that people will still have the ability and the inclination to run around with placards about something that they're upset about. If that's true, then we must accept that not much will have changed. In other words, you know, we'll still have placards, we'll still have the concept of running about, you know, we'll still be made out of meat, things like that. Sorry?
It's number one, right, and it's being publicised. I can see placards with free the machine, don't keep it in jail anymore, because it's tethered to the wall in my building.
Okay, so
I
don't think that's...
It's an abomination.
So the scenario that's just been described is that we might have people demonstrating in favour of machine rights.
Yeah.
I personally think that's a very unlikely scenario, simply because the only circumstance in which it could occur is if there exist machines which are perceived to have substantial sentience, to be, if you like, nearly human, but to be sufficiently subhuman that they are not already either being given or had not taken unilaterally the rights that they wanted. I don't think it's likely that machines of any kind will occupy that precise level of sentience for very long at all. I think once they get anywhere near that level, they'll be moving pretty fast in terms of overtaking it.
Yeah.
What about the other case? Turn the machine off, it's against God or something.
Now I think that, okay, so the alternative scenario that's just been described is that people will be protesting in favour of getting rid of machines that are of this nature. I'm reminded of that scene in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy where people were encouraged to throw out their digital watches, and because we didn't have to like the machines just because the machines liked us. And that seems to be also to be somewhat unrealistic, simply because of the same sort of thing, really, that once the machines get powerful enough that we actually care about turning them off, there's going to be other people who approve of them, and it's going to be a scenario very similar to what we saw in the Industrial Revolution, where the advantages are becoming so palpable that any resistance to them is very short-lived.
And the other scenario, it's you outside the building, and you're not allowed in, and you've got the placard, and you say, why can't I have my upload too?
No, there's no uploading yet. You know,
I think, Colin, I think a very important point that you've raised, as a kind of side issue to that, is that we as humans have a natural propensity to assume agency in other objects, even inanimate objects, cars and fridges,
we get upset
whatever.
about teddy bears.
Sorry?
We get upset without teddy bears being hurt.
All right, the danger that we will have, one of the clear and present dangers that we will face over the next 15 to 20 years is that we will start to get machines which are so good at response, at banter, discussion, you know, the whole Watson thing taken through Moore's Law through another 10 years, that we will naturally imbue those machines with consciousness, which they may, I'm not saying they will have, I'm just saying that they will act as if they have it. And as such, then we will defer to those machines, that we will see them in some kind of moral light. Now, to me, of course, an inanimate object like this is amoral, that the basis of morality is consciousness, that you cannot be immoral to an unconscious entity. That the thing that makes us special, all of us as humans, that makes us effectively equal, no matter how big or tall or fat or crippled or whatever we are, is the fact that we all have this, or I assume we all have this, spark of consciousness. That inside each one of you is that sense of being, that inner sense of self, which makes us special, which makes us empathic to each other, to say, that person feels pain. A machine will just react to it. It might say, ow, it might say, don't do that, it might run away, it might defend itself, but it doesn't actually feel it. It's this feeling that is the basis of all morality. It's that actual embodiment of self. Now, one of the big dangers I think that we have, and this will certainly come into play when we get to a stage where we can start uploading us, if we upload us into a physical substrate, we may create an entity which could talk like you, which has your memories, but there's nothing home. There's nothing there. And that, we'd throw the baby out with the bathwater, and I think that is a real danger that we face.
Well, in terms of motivation, why have I'm 10 years in, I've lost over $1 million in earnings in committing to this project. I'm about to sell my house to start the funding process, and my motivation is precisely because I care about my kids. Okay?
A question.
You mentioned humanity and our human nature and the concern that lots of people have about retaining that human nature. But my first question is, why is that? And my second question is, what's so good about our human nature? And if you look at our evolved morality, for example, we're naturally altruistic, but we're also quite violent, as Second Life shows. So my question is, could we perhaps improve our morality with the post-human and keep the good aspects like altruism and change the bad ones?
Yes, I think you just said it in a nutshell. That's the premise of transhumanism. One of them, I think that the two central premises of transhumanism is number one, life extension or life expansion. Number two, preserving elements of the human condition, so to speak, that looks at the humane aspects of being human as consequential to our future. That it's just like, if you add a lot of technology to you, if you pen your body a lot, that doesn't make you more human. It doesn't make you more futuristic. It doesn't make you more evolved. It's how you do it and the behavior about it. So the humaneness of humanity is what is so consequential to the elements and the behavior of being human, and that of course is consciousness, whatever that is. And it's the aspects of love and understanding, compassion, empathy, graciousness, kindness, generosity, all those attributes that we aspire towards, and when we reach a level of maturation that we nestle with, that become part of us more and more, and we call that wisdom. Well, what is wisdom after all? It's not our level of IQ, it's our level of reciprocity and understanding and getting it, understanding each other and the world around us. That's what Siddhartha traveled for. That's what, the quest of life is all about.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a distinction to be made here between using technology to, if you like, eliminate the undesirable aspects of human nature by force, as opposed to the use of technology to raise people's quality of life and people's opportunities to an extent that those negative qualities disappear of their own accord. I think that latter alternative is more likely, and indeed more, to my mind, more attractive. I think we can already see that sort of thing happening in the way that society has developed over recent history. Well, I say recent history, let's say the past century or two. For example, the fact is we haven't got so many wars these days. Certainly in the industrialized world, wars have almost gone away. And of course here I speak only about wars between countries that are in the industrialized world. That probably happened because the general public and thereby policymakers and so on tend to place a greater value on life than we used to. That seems to me to be very much the sort of thing that you're talking about.
Yes, it's interesting because that reptilian quality, in the core of our brainstem, the fight or flight, was very necessary for our survival early on. And even though we still have elements of it that cause, the anger, the anxiety, the greed, the hate, all these emotions that are disingenuous to our true nature of wanting to live longer and survive, that they may not become so necessary anymore. We shed behaviors that don't serve a purpose for us. Maybe at an earlier age I may have been a certain way that no longer serves me because I outgrew it, or I learned that it doesn't, in the end, serve me in a way that helps me benefit and achieve what I want to achieve. So we shed them. We shed these characteristics.
All right, but we have to be careful. The simple fact is that we evolved for millions of years in a particular evolutionary environment which sculpted what we call human. Now, sure, we're very much able to be culturally imprinted with things like language, etc. We have the ability to pick up various memes and ideas, but at a fundamental core, we are human. So there's a couple of problems if we start saying, oh, let's drop sex because it's messy or dirty or whatever. Let's drop anger because the simple fact is, as soon as you do that, you are no longer human. That what you have created is not human, and therefore you have effectively speciated. You now have a new species.
But it's not so black and white. You're saying you cut it off completely, but why is it necessary to cut it off completely? Certainly, we talked earlier about happiness and friendly AI and happiness. Who wants to be happy all the time, for God's sake? A certain level of anxiety and overcoming odds fulfills a sense of meaningfulness in our lives. We've achieved something. We've worked hard to acquire something. So I think that you might be looking at it as coming out with a glob, that of course would not be human. But our human emotions don't have to be as severe and as extreme as they once were.
Yeah, look, I'm not denying it, that we can define things about us that we like and enhance them and make them better, stronger, greater. But the core is that we've got to be very careful when we do that, that there won't be negative consequences to the overall system. We are in a very fine balance as individuals. We're not, it's a little bit like our mind is like a little ecosystem. And small disturbances, cutting something out, can make us effectively mad to others around us. They can look at it and say, no, that person is now mad, but no, that person's not mad to themselves, everyone else is. The simple fact is that what is human is going to change. Now, if we as extropians say, all right, which way do we want the human race to go as a species? And we say, obviously, we want them to be good. What do we define as good? So we go back into history, we look at Descartes, and we look at various philosophers, and we work out what is goodness? What is goodness? And the simple fact is that it's obviously, inductively, is when an individual does something for the group that they belong to. A mother does something for a child, we say, oh, that's good, that's wonderful. If somebody does something heroic for somebody else, that's wonderful. If a soldier dies for his platoon, that's considered heroic and good. So generally, inductively, the idea of goodness is doing something for the group in which you belong. The danger is if you start to change the group in which you belong, I just see that might lead to problems in the future.
But I don't see it as so severe. I don't think that there's a difference between benevolence and altruism. And there's that slight difference between those two. One is doing good for the group so that you are the hero, you are respected. How many times do we see that? And there's another of like kindness. You do it because you love to do it. You don't need the fanfare of being the one who did the good for the group. And I prefer the second, thank you very much.
Kindness to animals.
Yes.
From that.
Yes, and speaking of the human as if we are the only ones that have consciousness or feeling, my dog feels, and so does my cat. And I'm not so into ants and other insects, but I tell you that the animals have consciousness to a degree. They may not have the intellectual acumen of a scholarly mathematician, but hell, neither do I, and I am conscious. So let's not create this speciesism of the human species being better than other species. And I think that's something to be just as careful about as anything else. And now in the regard about separating human, just because you're going to enhance and extend life and improve some elements of behavior doesn't mean that you're going to forego the whole species. There are certain people within the species that I know quite well that are more evolved than other people within the species, thank you very much, but they're still within the species. So I respect everything you're saying and I hold it in high regard and you're extremely articulate about it, but I think the risk is very important and I agree with you on that front, but I don't think we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I think there are variations and striations of being within a species and continuing to be within that species.
Okay, we're just about out of time. Sorry, we're just about. No, we've run out of time. We've got time for one more question, and we'll have to get the panel to summarise. I'm afraid. No.
My question was actually a little bit of a follow-up to something you said earlier, James, where you were talking about we would defer to machines that could essentially mimic the humanness that we have. Were you implying that we will never be able to reproduce that humanness, that there's some kind of quality to that humanness that won't be able to be captured in the artificial? Or is it just that it's a very difficult problem and will take a long time?
Yeah, you were speaking a bit quietly, but I think the question was, do we think that there are aspects of what it is to be human that are in principle not capable of being reproduced in a manufactured, shall we say, entity, let's say an upload, for example. It's obviously an extremely deep and philosophical question. I think, personally, that the answer comes from an examination of the details of how the artificial organism would be created. I'm personally quite skeptical of the whole concept of uploading as embodied in certain proposals for how it might be done, for transfer of consciousness from wetware, shall we say, to silicon. However, I think that there are other proposals for how it might be done which avoid those problems. Specifically, I think that, and I'm not saying that this is necessarily practical, but it's not obviously impractical, that the incremental, progressive replacement of individual neurons by neuron-sized machines that did the same job and could interact with the old neurons and so on. If it was done slowly enough, one could end up with a completely non-biological brain without anyone at any point having to understand how the brain works or anything like that. That sort of situation, I can't see any real, I can't see any gap there, any conceptual gap that would in any way result in necessarily in the loss of some aspect of what it is to be a human being. However, I think ways of doing that transfer that were more, if you like, wholesale, more single step, seem to me to require a level of understanding of how a particular brain works, and is working, and what that brain has in it, that may, I'm not saying is, but may intrinsically be beyond human capacity to understand, and therefore, in order to do it, one would have to compromise on what was actually in that brain.
Remember years ago, oh sorry, I'm gonna pass it to you. Remember years ago, the first embryo baby, it was a woman who was developed outside the womb in a petri dish. And it was implanted in a womb, and the baby grew up, and everyone was skeptical, will this be human? Was it created in the womb? It was, a manufactured embryo from a sperm and an egg, and everyone was very concerned about whether that person would have a level of humanity. And of course that woman grew up, and she was a very lovely person. I've never met her, but from what I've heard and what I've read, she seems perfectly fine. So we're always very cautious about when we don't deal with our biology in the way that it is set up to be, whether that person's going to be human or not. And we see that with a number of individuals who have extreme prosthetic parts. Are they human? But then when we walk around the streets and we see prosthetic legs, prosthetic arms, etc., they seem human. So, but then we can say, are they really human, or is it, are we anthropomorphizing their prosthetics to make them appear human? So, but then what do we know about the human anyway? We know that I know I'm a human, at least I think I am, and I think you are too. So so all these levels can be discussed, but then if you get into other areas, and I think it's very important for us to do this, like constructivism, or we get into quantum mechanics, and these other fields that take a look at reality and whether our perceptions are all in our mind, as in extreme constructivism, or if there really is matter that we exist within. So we don't know. All we know is that what we think we know, basically. We've got to keep on questioning that. So in the long run, we don't know.
I think my answer to that question is that yes, it would be possible to build an entity that was indistinguishable from a human being that was not conscious. In other words, it's a zombie, and it's a philosophical discussion point about zombies. Would it be possible to do the incremental upload that Aubrey suggested? And the answer again is yes. Would we end up with a conscious entity at the other end? Did it still be saying, I'm Aubrey, I'm here, it worked? But is he really there? We don't know, because consciousness is a very subjective experience. only know of our own consciousness, and because we see others with similar substrates to ourselves, we assume it in other people. But we really don't know. So,
1, 2.
I think it's done.
Okay, so where was that? So I do think it is possible to build an entity which is identical to us in behaviour, answers questions, but is in fact not conscious. And the biggest danger with the incremental uploading, if it's done without an understanding of what creates that crossover between objective reality and subjective reality, which is our conscious experience, then it might be possible to create an automated version of Aubrey, which talks like Aubrey, says all the appropriate things, claims that it's Aubrey, but really isn't Aubrey.
You found me out.
But James, you have to admit that that's contentious. That's not a standard view of philosophy of consciousness.
Two experiments to think about here, the imitation game and also Schrödinger's cat. So, you know, when you think of copying over time, what stands out for me is I don't care whether I think it's Aubrey. If he thinks it's Aubrey and it's Aubrey as far as I'm concerned, who am I to judge whether it's him or not? If he says he's Aubrey, that's good enough for me. But as far as I'm concerned with my own identity, and I think that's what it boils down to, it's the continuity of identity. And that if it's done, if we say, okay, if it's done piece by piece, slowly, neuron by neuron, if we do it slowly enough and microscopically enough, it could be the same person after we're through. But what if we speed that up and do larger chunks? So it's all very questionable, and we don't know.
And what if it's not? What if we end up with everyone gets this process done and there's no one home? Until we have a theory of consciousness, which we do not yet have, until we have a theory of consciousness, any such experimentation would be dangerous. Once we understand consciousness, then fine, go for it. But at this stage, no. And I think we will certainly see in the next 10, 15 years, certainly conversational engines that pass the Turing test, that you can converse with and you feel that there's somebody home. But whether there is or not, that'll depend on the theory of consciousness behind it. Remember, these things, I can make a tape recorder that says that it's conscious. And it could, if it was lucky, let's say I have a tape recorder with 50,000 keys, and you ask a question, I happen to push a key at random and I get the right one, it might give intelligent answers. But no one here would think there's anything home. Now most computers are like that tape recorder. They just give and take. They just respond to their input. They don't have to feel it. They don't have to be aware of it. They just respond to it. Now some people might argue, given sufficient complexity, they will become aware. I don't necessarily buy that. I see consciousness as an extra dimension for which we have not yet got a theory, which some people in this room are actually working towards.
We're done.
So, one is good, death is bad, be nice.